The sun hung like a molten coin in the cloudless Montana sky as Josephine Sterling stepped off the stagecoach in Hecla, her legs unsteady after the grueling 3-day journey. She clutched her small valise, all that remained of her former life in Boston, and squinted at the dusty main street of the mining town that was to be her new home. The year was 1876, and like many towns that had sprung up across the West following the discovery of precious metals, Hecla was a chaotic blend of hastily constructed buildings, hopeful miners, and the businesses that sustained them. The air smelled of sawdust, horse manure, and possibility. Josephine had come west with dreams and little else. At 22, she was fleeing the shame of her father's financial ruin and subsequent suicide, which had left their family name tarnished in Boston society. Her mother had gone to live with a sister in Philadelphia, but Josephine had refused to be a burden. Instead, she'd answered an advertisement for teachers in the Montana Territory, where her educated background might provide her a fresh start. She took a tentative step forward, her traveling dress once fashionable but now creased and trail-worn hanging limply in the dry heat. The town seemed to waver before her eyes, buildings bending at impossible angles. Josephine blinked hard, attributing the strange vision to exhaustion. She hadn't eaten since the previous evening, having spent her last coins on the final leg of her journey. "Miss, you need some assistance." A gruff voice called from somewhere nearby, but Josephine found she couldn't turn her head to locate the speaker. The boardwalk beneath her feet seemed to tilt. "I'm quite all right," she managed to say, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Just need to find the schoolhouse." 3 more steps and the world began to dim around the edges. Josephine felt her knees buckle as consciousness slipped away from her grasp. The last sensation she registered was the feeling of falling through empty air. Clayton Ryder had just stepped out of Jenkins' general store when he saw the young woman collapse. Without hesitation, he crossed the boardwalk in 3 long strides and caught her before she hit the rough wooden planks. Her valise tumbled from her limp fingers, spilling a few modest possessions onto the dusty boards. "Miss, Miss," Clayton called, cradling her slight form against his chest. She was pale beneath her sun-flushed cheeks and too light in his arms, fragile as a bird with hollow bones. Several onlookers gathered, their expressions ranging from concern to morbid curiosity. "Is she dead?" asked a boy no more than 10, his eyes wide with excitement. "No, she's breathing," Clayton replied, feeling the faint rise and fall of her chest against his arm. "Just fainted." "Probably the heat." Old Mrs. Whittaker pushed through the small crowd. "More likely hunger, I'd wager. Look at her, thin as a rail." Clayton nodded grimly. He'd seen it before, folks arriving in Hecla with nothing but hope in their pockets, unprepared for the harsh realities of frontier life. He'd been one of them once, before the cattle ranch he'd built 5 miles outside of town had begun to prosper. "I'll take her to Sarah's cafe," he decided aloud. "Get some food in her when she wakes." Without waiting for approval, Clayton adjusted his hold on the unconscious woman and began walking down the boardwalk toward the small eating establishment at the end of the street. He was acutely aware of how she fit against him, her head resting against his shoulder, her breath warm even through his cotton shirt. Sarah's place was mercifully quiet at this hour, the lunch rush having ended and the dinner crowd not yet arrived. The proprietress, a plump woman with perpetually flushed cheeks, looked up from wiping a table when Clayton shouldered his way through the door. "Good Lord, what happened?" she exclaimed, hurrying forward. "She fainted out front of Jenkins' place," Clayton explained, carefully maneuvering between the tables. "Reckon she needs food and rest." He laid the woman gently on a bench in the corner booth, his usual spot when he came to town for supplies. Sarah quickly folded a tablecloth to place under her head. "Poor thing," Sarah murmured, examining the woman's pale face. "New in town, I'd guess." "Just off the stage," Clayton confirmed. "Her things are still out on the boardwalk. I should go fetch them before they disappear." "You do that." "I'll put some coffee on and heat up today's stew." When Clayton returned with the valise, the young woman was beginning to stir. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of summer sage. She blinked in confusion at the unfamiliar surroundings, then startled when she noticed Clayton standing awkwardly at the edge of the table. "Please don't be alarmed, miss," he said, setting her valise carefully on the floor beside her. "You fainted out on the boardwalk. I carried you in here to Sarah's cafe." The woman pushed herself up to a sitting position, a flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. I don't know what to say. Thank you, Mr. Ryder, Clayton Ryder. Most folks just call me Clay." "Josephine Sterling," she replied, extending a trembling hand that he took briefly in his much larger one. "I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience." "No inconvenience at all," Clay assured her, sliding onto the bench across from her. "Happens more often than you might think." The journey to Hecla isn't easy. Sarah appeared then with a steaming cup of coffee and a bowl of savory beef stew. "Here you are, dear. This should help put some color back in those cheeks." Josephine stared at the food with a mixture of longing and hesitation. "I'm afraid I haven't yet." Her voice trailed off and Clay understood immediately. "It's on me," he said firmly. "Consider it a welcome to Hecla." A flash of pride crossed her face, but hunger quickly overcame it. "I'll repay you," she insisted, before taking up the spoon with as much dignity as she could muster. Clay watched as she took a small, careful bite, then another with less restraint. Her composure cracked further with each mouthful, revealing the depth of her hunger. He signaled to Sarah to bring a basket of bread as well, which Josephine accepted with grateful eyes. "So, Miss Sterling, what brings you to our little corner of Montana?" Clay asked after she had eaten enough to take the desperate edge off her hunger. Josephine dabbed at her mouth with a napkin. "I've come to teach at the school. There was an advertisement in the Boston papers, the town council seeking someone with proper educational credentials." Clay's eyebrows rose. "That'd be Abner Holcomb's doing. Been trying to get a real school going here for the past year. Most mining towns don't bother much with education, but Hecla's starting to put down permanent roots." "And you, Mr. Ryder, what do you do here?" "I run the Double R Ranch about 5 miles east of town. Started with just 20 head of cattle 6 years ago, got closer to 500 now." Josephine nodded, her gaze taking in his weathered face, the faint lines at the corners of his blue eyes that spoke of years squinting against the sun. He wasn't handsome in the refined way of Boston gentlemen, but there was something compelling in his steady gaze and the quiet confidence with which he carried himself. "How old is your ranch?" she asked, genuinely interested. 6 years, give or take. Came out here in 70 after the war. Lot of us did, looking for something new. The war." Her eyes drifted to his left hand, which was missing the last 2 fingers. Clay followed her gaze and gave a small, tight smile. "Auntie Edem, I was just a boy 17, lied about my age to enlist." Josephine did a quick calculation. That would make him about 31 now, not so much older than herself, yet his eyes held experiences she could scarcely imagine. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He shrugged. "Long time ago, and I fared better than many." He shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the subject. "So you know where you're staying?" The question brought Josephine back to her immediate concerns. "The letter from the town council mentioned lodgings at Mrs. Wilcox's boarding house." Clay nodded. "That's right. Emma Wilcox runs a respectable place 2 streets over. Mostly teachers and unmarried shopkeepers stay there. And the school, is it far?" "New building at the north end of town, small but solid. You should probably check in with Mayor Holcomb first, though. His office is above the bank." Sarah returned to refill Josephine's coffee cup. "You look much better, dear. Got some color back." "Thank you," Josephine smiled. "The food was delicious." "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Sarah said kindly. "Any friend of Clay's is welcome here." "Oh, we're not," Josephine began, but Clay interrupted. "I should probably show Miss Sterling to Mayor Holcomb's office, then help her get settled at Emma's," he said, rising from the table. "If that's all right with you, Miss Sterling," Josephine hesitated only briefly before nodding. This man had shown her nothing but kindness, and she was, after all, a stranger in an unfamiliar town. "That would be most appreciated, Mr. Ryder." "Clay," he corrected her with a small smile. "Everyone calls me Clay." As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, Josephine felt steadier, though still embarrassed by her earlier weakness. The street was busier now, with miners beginning to emerge from their shifts and merchants closing up shops for the day. "I truly am grateful," she said as they walked. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. Someone would have helped," Clay replied with a shrug. "Folks here look out for each other, have to this far from civilization." "Is that how you see it? As being away from civilization," he glanced down at her. "Aren't we? No symphony orchestras or fancy theaters out here. No paved streets or gas lamps." "No, but there are other kinds of civilization," Josephine argued. "Community, neighborliness. The things you just described, people looking out for one another. That seems more civilized than some of what passes for society back east." Clay studied her with new interest. "You might just do all right here, Miss Sterling." "Josephine," she corrected him with a small smile of her own. "If I'm to call you Clay, then you must call me Josephine." Mayor Holcomb's office was a cramped room above the Hecla Miners' Bank, made smaller by the stacks of papers and maps covering every surface. The mayor himself was a portly man in his 50s with mutton chop whiskers and an enthusiastic handshake. "Miss Sterling, we'd almost given up hope," he exclaimed, pumping her hand vigorously. "Your last letter said you'd arrive 2 weeks ago." Josephine withdrew her hand with as much politeness as she could manage. "There were delays with the railroad, and then the stagecoach broke an axle near Helena. I do apologize for any inconvenience." No, the important thing is you're here now," Holcomb assured her. "School term starts in 2 weeks, plenty of time to get you settled." He noticed Clay standing quietly by the door. "Ah, Ryder, good to see you, bringing our new schoolteacher to meet me, eh?" "Miss Sterling had a bit of trouble when she arrived," Clay explained simply. "I'm helping her get oriented." Holcomb nodded, missing the significance. "Good man. Now, Miss Sterling, we've arranged lodging for you at Mrs. Wilcox's boarding house, very respectable establishment. The school building is ready, though we're still awaiting some of the books and supplies ordered from back east." "I brought some materials with me," Josephine assured him. "Basic primers and mathematical texts." "Excellent, excellent," Holcomb beamed. "The children of Hecla will finally have proper schooling. We've got about 30 students enrolled already, ages 6 to 16. Mostly boys, of course, but a fair number of girls too. Even a few of the miners have expressed interest in evening lessons." Josephine's heart lifted at this news. Perhaps here she could truly make a difference, build something worthwhile from the ashes of her former life. After finalizing arrangements for her salary modest, but including room and board, Clay escorted her to Mrs. Wilcox's boarding house. The 2-story clapboard building was neatly painted white with green shutters, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn structures that dominated much of Hecla. Mrs. Wilcox herself answered their knock, a thin, straight-backed woman of about 60 whose severe appearance was softened by kind eyes. "You must be Miss Sterling," she said, opening the door wider. "We'd begun to worry." "The journey took longer than anticipated," Josephine explained as they stepped into a tidy parlor furnished with mismatched but well-maintained pieces. "Mr. Ryder has been kind enough to assist me since my arrival." Mrs. Wilcox's eyebrows rose slightly as she took in Clay's presence, but she merely nodded. "Mr. Ryder is known for his gallantry. Now, let me show you to your room. You must be exhausted." Clay cleared his throat. "I'll leave you in Mrs. Wilcox's capable hands, then," he said, setting Josephine's valise down. "If you need anything, Sarah at the cafe usually knows where to find me when I'm in town." "Thank you again," Josephine said warmly, "for everything." Something passed between them, then a moment of connection that surprised them both. Clay nodded once, touched the brim of his hat, and departed. Mrs. Wilcox led Josephine upstairs to a small but clean room at the back of the house. A narrow bed, a washstand, a simple dresser, and a writing desk comprised the furnishings, with a rag rug adding a touch of color to the plain wooden floor. "It's not fancy," Mrs. Wilcox said, "but it's comfortable. Bathrooms at the end of the hall you'll share with Miss Peterson, the seamstress, and Miss Granger, who clerks at Jenkins' store. Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6. You're on your own for the midday meal. It's perfect," Josephine assured her, feeling tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. After weeks of uncertainty and travel, the simple room seemed like a haven. "Rules are simple," Mrs. Wilcox continued. "No gentlemen callers in your rooms. Parlor visits end at 8 o'clock. No alcohol on the premises. Church attendance is expected but not required." Josephine nodded her understanding. "And one more thing," Mrs. Wilcox added, her voice softening slightly. "Whatever drove you here and everyone who comes to Hecla is running from something it stays in the past. Here you're just Miss Sterling, the schoolteacher." With that, she left Josephine to unpack her meager belongings and contemplate the strange turns that had brought her to this place. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and adjustment. Josephine threw herself into readying the schoolhouse, organizing what supplies were available, and creating lesson plans appropriate for the varied ages and educational backgrounds of her future students. Mayor Holcomb introduced her around town, and she slowly began to find her footing in the community. Clayton Ryder remained largely absent, having returned to his ranch after seeing her settled. Josephine told herself that the occasional pang of disappointment she felt when entering Sarah's cafe only to find his corner table empty was merely gratitude seeking an outlet. Still, she found herself listening more attentively when his name was mentioned in conversation. "Ryder's got the best cattle operation in Madison County," she overheard one miner telling another. "Started with nothing, now employs 5 hands year-round and more during roundup. Keeps to himself mostly," Sarah told her when Josephine finally worked up the courage to ask about him directly. "Good man, though, fair in business, generous when someone's in need. Never seen him show special attention to a lady before you, though," she added with a knowing smile that made Josephine blush. "He was simply being kind to a stranger," she protested. Sarah's smile only widened. "If you say so, dear." The Saturday before school was to begin, Josephine was arranging the last of the newly arrived textbooks when the schoolhouse door opened. She looked up, expecting Mayor Holcomb or perhaps one of the curious parents who had been stopping by, and felt her heart give an unexpected leap when Clayton Ryder stepped inside. "Good afternoon," he said, removing his hat. His hair was slightly longer than she remembered, curling at the collar of his clean but well-worn shirt. "Hear you're opening for learning on Monday, Mr. Ryder," Josephine acknowledged, willing her voice to remain steady. "Yes, everything is finally ready. Or as ready as it can be, given the circumstances." Clay looked around the small schoolroom with its rows of simple benches and desks. The blackboard Josephine had painstakingly cleaned and polished, the shelf of books that represented her greatest treasure. "You've done wonders with the place," he observed. "When Holcomb first proposed the school, most folks thought it was just talk. Mining towns aren't known for their commitment to education." "Hecla seems different," Josephine said. "People here care about building something that lasts." Clay nodded. "Some do." He seemed to be wrestling with something, shifting his hat in his hands. "I brought you something," he finally said. "A welcome gift, I suppose." From his saddlebag, he produced a package wrapped in brown paper. Josephine accepted it with surprise, carefully undoing the string that bound it. Inside was a beautifully bound copy of Walden by Henry David Thoreau. "Oh," she breathed, running her fingers over the embossed cover. How did you know?" Clay looked pleased by her reaction. "You mentioned Thoreau that day at Sarah's, said his ideas about simple living had influenced your decision to come west. Ordered it from Helena next time I sent for supplies." Josephine was touched beyond words that he had remembered such a detail from their brief conversation. She opened the book to find an inscription on the flyleaf. "To Miss J. Sterling, may you find what you seek in our wilderness, C. Ryder, "Thank you," she said, looking up at him with shining eyes. "I shall treasure it." Clay cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with her emotion. "It's nothing. Just thought you might like some proper reading, being educated and all." "Are you staying in town tonight?" Josephine asked impulsively. "Plan to. Got business with the freight office tomorrow morning." "Then perhaps you would join me for dinner at Sarah's." "To thank you properly for your kindness." Something flickered in his eyes, pleasure, uncertainty, and something deeper she couldn't name. "Wouldn't be proper me accepting thanks for basic decency." "Then not as thanks," Josephine pressed, "as friends sharing a meal." After a moment's hesitation, Clay nodded. "All right, then. 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, she confirmed and watched him leave with a curious lightness in her chest. That evening, as Josephine entered Sarah's cafe, she was conscious of having taken extra care with her appearance. Her green dress, one of only 3 she owned, was simple but flattering, and she had arranged her chestnut hair in a style that softened her features. Clay was already seated at his usual corner table, and he stood when she approached. Something in his expression as he took in her appearance sent a warm flush to her cheeks. "You look very nice," he said awkwardly as he held her chair. "Thank you," Josephine replied, settling her napkin in her lap. "I don't have many occasions to wear anything but practical clothes these days." The initial conversation was strained, both of them carefully avoiding anything too personal. They discussed the upcoming school term, the changing weather, and Clay's cattle business. Gradually, however, the awkwardness dissolved as they discovered shared interests and compatible viewpoints. "So what really brought you to Montana Territory?" Clay asked as they lingered over coffee and apple pie. "Boston society ladies don't typically seek out frontier teaching positions." Josephine hesitated, then decided on honesty. "My father was a banker who made some unfortunate investments. When they failed, he took his own life rather than face the disgrace. My mother went to live with relatives, but I couldn't bear the pity of former friends. I wanted to build something of my own, somewhere my name didn't carry the weight of scandal." Clay's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were compassionate. "That took courage, or desperation," Josephine replied with a sad smile. "What about you? Why Hecla specifically? Land was cheap. Few people wanted to try raising cattle this close to mining country. They all headed for the grasslands further east. But I saw potential in the valley where my ranch sits. Good water, sheltered position." He paused. "And I liked that Hecla wasn't just a tent city that would disappear when the silver played out. People here are building for the long term." "Like you," Josephine observed. "I suppose so." He studied her face in the lamplight. "Never expected to find someone like you here, though." "Someone like me, educated, refined, but not afraid of hard work or real talk." He looked away as if embarrassed by his candor. "Makes a man reconsider certain notions." "What notions?" Josephine asked softly. Clay met her eyes again. "That some distances can't be bridged. That some differences matter more than similarities." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Sarah appeared to clear their plates, breaking the spell. "Would you care to walk for a bit?" Clay asked as they stepped outside into the cool evening air. "Night like this seems a shame to waste." Josephine knew she should decline. Mrs. Wilcox's rules about appropriate behavior were clear, and her position as the town's teacher required irreproachable conduct. But the night was indeed beautiful, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet, and Clay's presence beside her felt right in a way she couldn't articulate. "Just a short walk," she agreed. They strolled along the boardwalk, their conversation flowing more easily now. Clay pointed out buildings and shared stories about the town's early days, how the first silver strike had been made by a man chasing his runaway mule. How the original settlers had lived in tents through a brutal winter before proper buildings could be constructed. "You love this place," Josephine observed as they paused at the edge of town, looking out toward the mountains silhouetted against the night sky. "I do," Clay admitted. "It's not perfect, nothing is, but it's honest. What you see is what you get." "Is that true of its people as well?" He turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Some of us try to be." Josephine was acutely aware of his proximity, of the quiet strength he radiated. In Boston, she would never have found herself alone with a man like Clayton Ryder, a man whose hands bore the calluses of hard work rather than the smooth polish of privilege. Yet here, in this moment, she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. "I should get back," she said reluctantly. "School begins tomorrow and Mrs. Wilcox will be concerned." Clay nodded, offering his arm with unexpected gallantry. "I'll see you safely home." At the boarding house door they paused, neither quite ready to end the evening. "Thank you for dinner," Clay said, "and the company." "Thank you for the book," Josephine replied, "and for showing me more of Hecla." He hesitated, then reached out to brush a stray curl from her cheek, his touch feather light. "Good night, Josephine." "Good night, Clay." She watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness, and knew with sudden clarity that her life in Hecla had just become infinitely more complicated. The first day of school dawned clear and crisp, with the promise of autumn in the air. Josephine rose early, her stomach fluttering with nervous anticipation. By 7:30, she was at the schoolhouse, arranging papers and checking that everything was in place for her students' arrival. They began trickling in just before 8 children in clean but worn clothing, their faces showing varying degrees of enthusiasm and apprehension. By 8 o'clock, 32 students ranging from 6 to 16 filled the benches, regarding their new teacher with curious eyes. Josephine took a deep breath and stepped to the front of the room. "Good morning. My name is Miss Sterling, and I am honored to be your teacher." The day passed in a blur of introductions, assessments, and establishing routines. Josephine was both exhausted and exhilarated by the time she dismissed her class at 3 o'clock. She remained behind, making notes about each student's abilities and planning the next day's lessons. A knock at the door interrupted her work. She looked up to see Mrs. Jenkins, the storekeeper's wife, standing in the doorway with her 10-year-old son, Timothy. "Miss Sterling, might we have a word?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, ushering her reluctant son forward. "Of course," Josephine replied, setting aside her papers. "What can I do for you?" "It's about Timothy's writing," Mrs. Jenkins explained. "He struggles something awful, and the previous teacher, well, she didn't have much patience for slow learners." Timothy stared at the floor, his ears red with shame. "Timothy is very bright," Josephine said firmly, addressing both mother and son. "I noticed today that he answered my questions about mathematics quite readily. Different minds learn in different ways, that's all." The boy looked up, surprise and cautious hope in his eyes. "Would you be willing to stay after school twice a week for extra help?" Josephine asked him directly. "I have some special methods that might make reading easier for you." Timothy glanced at his mother, then nodded shyly. "That's very generous of you, Miss Sterling, Mrs. Jenkins said, clearly relieved. His father wanted to pull him out of school entirely, send him to work in the store full-time, said there's no point in education if the boy can't even read. "Every child deserves an education," Josephine stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. "And every child can learn, given the right support." After they left, Josephine returned to her papers with renewed determination. This was why she had come to Hecla, to make a difference, to build something meaningful. If she sometimes caught herself looking out the window toward the eastern hills where Clay's ranch lay, well, that was merely idle curiosity. The weeks passed, and Josephine settled into the rhythm of life in Hecla. Her students were making progress. The townspeople had accepted her as one of their own, and she found unexpected fulfillment in her work. She saw Clay occasionally, sometimes at church on Sundays, once or twice at Sarah's cafe when he came to town for supplies. Their interactions were friendly but brief, always under the watchful eyes of the community. Then came the early October day that changed everything. Josephine was leading her students through a geography lesson when the classroom door burst open. Sam Jenkins, Timothy's 16-year-old brother, stood in the doorway, his face ashen. "Fire," he gasped. The North Mine shaft, there's been an explosion. The children erupted in panic, several jumping to their feet. Quietly, Josephine commanded, her own heart racing. Everyone sit down. When order was restored, she turned to Sam. How bad is it? Bad, he replied grimly. They're calling for all able-bodied men to help with rescue. Doc Henderson says to bring any clean linens to the assay office. They're setting up a hospital there. Josephine made a swift decision. Class is dismissed. Older students see the younger ones safely home. Anyone whose father works in the mine, go directly to the assay office. The rest of you stay with your families. As the children filed out, Josephine gathered her shawl and hurried toward her boarding house to collect what linens she could spare. The town was in chaos, with people running toward the northern edge where smoke could be seen rising from the mine entrance. At Mrs. Wilcox's, Josephine quickly stripped her bed and grabbed clean towels. She was rushing back out when she nearly collided with Clay, who was striding purposefully toward the center of town. "Clay," she exclaimed. "You've heard about the mine," he nodded grimly. "Was on my way in with a wagon of supplies, heard the explosion from half a mile out." His eyes were dark with concern. "You should stay inside. It's going to get ugly out there." "I'm going to the assay office to help," Josephine informed him, clutching her bundle of linens. "Doctor Henderson needs assistance." Clay looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. "All right, but be careful. These situations can turn desperate fast." They parted ways, Clay toward the mine where men were needed to help with the rescue, Josephine to the assay office where the injured would be brought. The scene at the makeshift hospital was one Josephine would never forget. Dr. Henderson, a gruff man in his 60s who served as Hecla's only physician, had cleared the central tables and was organizing the space for casualties. Several women from town were already there, boiling water and tearing fabric into bandages. "Miss Sterling," the doctor acknowledged her arrival. "Set those linens there and help Mrs. Granger prepare the tables. We'll need to disinfect everything we can." For the next several hours, Josephine worked tirelessly alongside the other women, preparing for the injured and then tending to them as they arrived, men with burns, broken limbs, and lungs full of deadly mine dust. Some could be saved, others were beyond help. Through it all, Josephine moved from patient to patient, offering water, holding hands, and assisting the doctor as needed. It was well past midnight when Clay appeared in the doorway, his face blackened with soot, his clothes torn and filthy. His eyes found Josephine immediately, and the relief in them was palpable. She crossed to him quickly. "Are you hurt?" she asked, scanning him for injuries. "No," he replied, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Just came to report. We've reached all the accessible areas. 17 men out safely, 8 injured, 5. He hesitated. 5 didn't make it. Josephine closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the grim news. "What about the Johnson boys? Timothy's been asking about his cousins. Both alive. Luke's got a broken arm, but they'll be all right." Clay swayed slightly on his feet, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "You need to sit down," Josephine insisted, leading him to a relatively quiet corner where a bench stood against the wall. "When did you last eat or drink anything?" Clay shook his head. "Don't remember." "Been digging since I got here." Josephine brought him water and what remained of the stew someone had delivered earlier for the volunteers. As he ate, she gently cleaned a cut on his forehead with a damp cloth. "You should be resting," he said between mouthfuls. "You've been at this as long as I have." "I'm fine," she assured him, though in truth her back ached and her eyes burned with fatigue. "The injured need attention more than I need sleep." Clay caught her hand as she dabbed at his wound. "You're something else, you know that. Most ladies I've known would have fainted at the sight of half of what you've dealt with today." "I'm not most ladies," Josephine replied with a small smile. "As you may have noticed," his hand remained around hers, warm and strong despite his exhaustion. "I noticed," he said quietly. "From the first day." A commotion at the door interrupted whatever might have followed. Two men carried in another miner, this one barely conscious and badly burned. Got to get back, Clay said, releasing her hand and standing. They're still shoring up the tunnel so we can recover the bodies. Be careful, Josephine urged, suddenly afraid for him. The mountain has claimed enough lives today. He nodded once, his eyes conveying what words could not, then disappeared back into the night. Dawn was breaking when the last of the bodies was brought out of the mine. The town of Hecla, stunned by its first major tragedy, moved in a collective daze of grief and exhaustion. Dr. Henderson finally ordered Josephine and the other volunteers to go home and rest, assuring them that the worst was over. Josephine stepped outside into the pale morning light, her dress stained with blood and soot, her hair falling from its pins. The walk to Mrs. Wilcox's boarding house seemed impossibly long. She had gone only a block when she heard someone call her name. Clay sat on the edge of the boardwalk outside Sarah's cafe, which had remained open all night to feed the rescue workers. He looked as exhausted as Josephine felt, but he rose when he saw her. "Thought you might like some hot coffee before you head home," he said, gesturing to the cafe. "Sarah's still serving." Josephine should have declined. Protocol demanded that she thank him politely and continue on her way. But the events of the past day had stripped away such considerations, leaving only the raw truth that she needed his company. "Coffee sounds wonderful," she admitted. Inside, Sarah took one look at them and ushered them to Clay's corner table, bringing coffee and fresh bread without being asked. The cafe was quiet, most of the miners having finally gone home to their families. "5 dead," Clay said after they had eaten in silence for a few minutes. "Could have been much worse. If the explosion had happened deeper in the main shaft," Josephine shuddered at the thought. Those poor families. "I have 3 of the Murphy children in my class. Their father was one of those killed." "Mining towns understand loss," Clay said grimly. "There'll be a fund set up for the widows and orphans. I'll contribute." "As will I," Josephine said, "though I have little enough to give." "You gave plenty today," Clay assured her. "Henderson said he couldn't have managed without you and the other women." Josephine sipped her coffee, too tired to feel any pride in the compliment. "I've never seen death like that before," she admitted softly. "In Boston, it happened behind closed doors, sanitized and separate. It's different out here," Clay agreed. "More immediate, but there's dignity in facing it squarely, I think." They lapsed into silence again, sharing the quiet comfort of each other's presence as the sun rose higher in the sky. Finally, Clay spoke again, his voice low and uncertain. "This isn't how I planned to ask, and maybe it's not the right time with everything that's happened, but would you allow me to call on you? Properly, I mean." Josephine looked up, startled by the question despite the growing connection she had felt between them. "Call on me. Sunday afternoons at Mrs. Wilcox's parlor," Clay clarified, "like proper folks do." A slow warmth spread through Josephine's chest, pushing back the chill of the long, terrible night. "Yes," she said simply, "I would like that very much." Clay's smile transformed his tired face. "Good, that's good." Outside, they paused before parting ways, suddenly shy despite all they had shared in the crucible of crisis. "Get some rest," Clay told her. "You've earned it." "You as well," Josephine replied, "and Clay, thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me," she said softly. "The real me, not just the Boston lady or the school teacher." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "Rest well, Josephine." The mine disaster marked a turning point for Hecla and for Josephine and Clay. The town came together in its grief, supporting the bereaved families and rebuilding what had been damaged. And on the Sunday afternoon following the tragedy, Clayton Ryder appeared at Mrs. Wilcox's boarding house at precisely 2 o'clock, freshly shaved and wearing his best shirt, a small bouquet of late wildflowers in his hand. Mrs. Wilcox showed him into the parlor where Josephine waited, her heart beating a rapid rhythm against her ribs. She had worn her blue dress her finest and arranged her hair with special care. The knowing smile Mrs. Wilcox gave her before discreetly withdrawing to the kitchen suggested that her efforts had not gone unnoticed. "These are for you," Clay said, offering the wildflowers with endearing awkwardness. "Not much, I know, but there's not exactly a flower shop in Hecla." "They're beautiful," Josephine assured him, genuinely touched by the gesture. "I'll put them in water right away." When she returned from the kitchen with the flowers in a small vase, Clay was still standing, his hat in his hands, looking decidedly uncomfortable in the feminine surroundings of the parlor. "Please, sit down," Josephine invited, gesturing to the sofa. She took the armchair opposite, arranging her skirts with more care than necessary. "This is strange, isn't it?" Clay said after a moment of strained silence. "After everything we've been through, sitting here like we're just getting acquainted." Josephine laughed, relieved by his frankness. "It is rather absurd, but Mrs. Wilcox insists on propriety, and as the town's teacher I can hardly afford to flout convention." "No, you're right," Clay agreed. "Your reputation matters, especially with what you're trying to build here." That he understood the precarious nature of her position without explanation only increased Josephine's growing affection for him. "How are things at your ranch?" she asked. "I imagine you had a lot to catch up on after the days you spent helping with the rescue." Clay relaxed visibly, on familiar ground with this topic. "Ranch work never stops, but my foreman, Martinez, kept things running while I was in town. Good man, been with me almost from the start." Their conversation flowed more easily after that, touching on Clay's plans for expanding his herd, Josephine's progress with her students, and shared observations about life in Hecla. Before they realized it, Mrs. Wilcox was clearing her throat from the doorway, signaling that the acceptable visiting time had elapsed. "Next Sunday?" Clay asked as he prepared to leave. "I would like that," Josephine replied, and so began a courtship that soon became the subject of gentle gossip throughout Hecla. Each Sunday, Clay would appear at Mrs. Wilcox's parlor, sometimes with wildflowers, once with a book of poetry he had ordered from Helena. Occasionally, when weather and propriety permitted, they would walk together through town, always in public view, always maintaining a respectable distance. In the classroom, Josephine found herself speaking of Clay's ranch when teaching about local industry and economy. Her students, particularly the boys, were fascinated by stories of cattle drives and roundups. "Miss Sterling, is Mr. Ryder your beau?" 10-year-old Sally Peterson asked one day after class, her eyes wide with romantic curiosity. "Mr. Ryder is a friend who occasionally calls on me," Josephine replied carefully, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "Ma says he's sweet on you," Sally persisted. "She says he never paid mind to any lady before you came to town." "That's enough, Sally," Josephine said firmly. "Run along home now." But the child's words stayed with her, warming her through the increasingly cold autumn days. November brought early snow and Thanksgiving preparations. The town planned a community celebration in the newly completed church hall, with each family contributing what they could to the feast. Josephine, whose culinary skills were limited by both ability and the sparse facilities at Mrs. Wilcox's, offered to decorate the hall and organize activities for the children. The day before Thanksgiving, Clay appeared at the schoolhouse as Josephine was finishing her preparations for the holiday break. "Thought you might need help carrying those," he said, nodding toward the stack of books and papers on her desk. "Thank you," she replied, pleased by his thoughtfulness. "They do get heavy by the time I reach the boarding house." As they walked through the snow-dusted streets, Clay seemed preoccupied, choosing his words with unusual care. "I was wondering if you might save me a seat tomorrow at the Thanksgiving dinner." "Of course," Josephine agreed readily, "though I thought you might be dining with the Holcombs." "The mayor mentioned inviting you." "He did," Clay acknowledged, "but I'd rather sit with you if that's all right." Something in his tone made Josephine glance up at him curiously. "Is everything all right, Clay? You seem distracted." He stopped walking, turning to face her in the middle of the quiet street. I've been doing some thinking, Josephine, about the future. My future specifically. Oh, she said, her heart suddenly pounding. I've built something good with the ranch, he continued. It's profitable now, stable. The house is finished, proper timber frame, not the cabin I started with. Got 4 bedrooms, a real kitchen, even glass windows imported from Denver. It sounds lovely, Josephine said softly, hardly daring to hope what this recitation might lead to. It's missing something, though, Clay said, his blue eyes intent on hers. Someone to share it with, a family to fill those empty rooms. Josephine could scarcely breathe. Clay, I know it's soon, he rushed on. We've only known each other a few months, and I'm not asking not yet. Just wanted you to know where my thoughts have been heading, that my intentions are serious. Relief and disappointment mingled in Josephine's breast. I see. Clay studied her face anxiously. Have I overstepped? If your feelings don't run in the same direction, they do, Josephine assured him quickly. Very much so. The smile that lit his face then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Good, that's very good. They resumed walking, both a little dazed by the almost declaration that hung between them. At the boarding house door, Clay handed her the books and papers, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. Until tomorrow, then, he said. Until tomorrow, Josephine echoed, watching him walk away with a heart full of unexpected joy. The Thanksgiving celebration was everything a frontier town could hope for: abundant food, music provided by local talent, and a spirit of genuine gratitude for having survived another year in the harsh but beautiful Montana territory. Josephine sat beside Clay at one of the long tables, acutely aware of the approving glances sent their way by various townspeople. After the meal, as families mingled and children played, Clay drew Josephine aside to a relatively quiet corner of the hall. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket. An early Christmas gift, you might say. He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Curious, Josephine unwrapped it to find a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a book with a tiny key attached. It's beautiful, she breathed, running her finger over the intricate details. Reminded me of you, Clay said simply. The key seemed right to education being the key to opportunity and all that. Josephine was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift and the understanding it represented of her values and purpose. Will you help me put it on? Clay carefully pinned the brooch to the collar of her dress, his fingers surprisingly deft despite their size and strength. When he finished, he didn't step back immediately, and Josephine found herself looking up into his face, so close she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes. Josephine, he said softly, I know we agreed to take things slow, but I find myself thinking about you all the time. When I'm at the ranch, I imagine you there. When I'm in town, I look for you in every doorway. I think about you too, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. More than I should, perhaps. His hand came up to cup her cheek, a gesture of such tenderness it made her heart ache. I'm falling in love with you, he said simply. Thought you should know. Before Josephine could respond, Mayor Holcomb's voice boomed across the hall, calling everyone's attention for the annual Thanksgiving address. Clay reluctantly dropped his hand and took a step back, but his eyes remained on hers, waiting. I'm falling in love with you too, Josephine whispered, and was rewarded with a smile that warmed her to her toes despite the drafty hall. They rejoined the gathering, standing side by side as Mayor Holcomb extolled the virtues of hard work, community, and faith that had built Hecla into more than just another mining camp. Josephine was only half listening, her mind and heart too full of Clay's declaration and her own response to focus on the mayor's well-meaning platitudes. Winter descended on Hecla with a vengeance in December, bringing blizzards that sometimes made it impossible for Clay to journey into town from his ranch. During these separations, Josephine threw herself into her teaching and the preparations for the school's Christmas pageant, trying not to count the days until she might see him again. When the weather cleared enough for travel, Clay would appear at the schoolhouse door or Mrs. Wilcox's parlor, his face reddened by cold but his eyes warm with pleasure at seeing her. Their courtship progressed steadily, observed with approval by most of the town's residents. There were exceptions, of course. Abigail Thornton, the widow of a mine owner who had set her sights on Clay before Josephine's arrival, made her disapproval known through pointed remarks at church socials. And some of the older miners grumbled that the schoolteacher was too fancy for a man like Ryder, suggesting he'd be better off with a frontier bred woman who understood the hardships of ranch life. "Does it bother you?" Josephine asked Clay one Sunday afternoon as they sat in Mrs. Wilcox's parlor, a rare moment of privacy granted by their hostess's convenient errand to the kitchen. "What people say," Clay's expression was bemused. "About us, you mean? Why would it? Some people think I'm not suited to life out here, that I'm too Eastern, too refined." Clay took her hand, a liberty he allowed himself only when they were reasonably sure of not being observed. "Those people don't know you very well," he said firmly. "I've seen you roll up your sleeves and work alongside everyone else when there's need. You've faced things that would send most Boston ladies into a swoon with calm and courage." His faith in her was both comforting and terrifying. Josephine had come to love Hecla and its people, but the prospect of ranch life more isolated, more physically demanding still intimidated her. Not that Clay had formally proposed yet, though the direction of their relationship seemed increasingly clear to them both. "What about children?" she asked suddenly. "Do you want them?" If Clay was surprised by the abrupt question, he didn't show it. "Yes," he said simply. "Always figured I'd have a family someday. It's partly why I built the house so big, had to believe I'd fill it eventually." "How many?" Josephine pressed, needing to understand the future that might await her. Clay considered this seriously. "Never really counted." "As many as God sees fit to send, I suppose. Though," he added with a gentle squeeze of her hand, "I'd be content with just you if that's how things turned out." The sincerity in his voice eased something in Josephine's chest. Whatever uncertainties lay ahead, Clay's steadfast nature and clear-eyed acceptance of life's realities would be a foundation she could build upon. Christmas in Hecla was a community affair, with the school pageant serving as the centerpiece of the celebrations. Josephine's students performed a nativity play and recited poems they had memorized for the occasion. Parents and townspeople packed the schoolhouse, their faces glowing with pride and the simple joy of tradition maintained despite frontier hardships. Clay sat in the front row, watching not the children but Josephine as she directed the proceedings with gentle authority. When the youngest students sang "Silent Night" in their piping voices, she caught his eye across the room and felt a connection so profound, it momentarily took her breath away. After the pageant, as families dispersed to their homes for Christmas Eve supper, Clay approached Josephine with a small wrapped package. "Another early gift," she teased, accepting it. "This one's actually for Christmas," he replied, "but I wanted to give it to you privately." Curious, Josephine unwrapped the package to reveal a small wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft fabric, was a ring, a simple gold band set with a modest diamond that caught the lamplight. Josephine looked up in surprise to find Clay watching her intently, his expression a mixture of hope and vulnerability she had never seen in him before. "I'm not one for fancy speeches," he said quietly. "But I love you, Josephine Sterling. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." The schoolhouse was empty now except for the two of them, the children's decorations still festooning the walls, the smell of pine boughs and candle wax hanging in the air. Josephine looked from the ring to Clay's face, her heart so full she could scarcely speak. "Are you certain?" She finally managed. I don't know the first thing about ranch life." "You'll learn," Clay said confidently. "And I'll learn about the things that matter to you. We'll figure it out together." Josephine thought of her life before Hecla, the confined expectations, the measured relationships, the emphasis on appearance over substance. Then she thought of the past months, the genuine connections she'd formed, the sense of purpose she'd discovered, and most of all, the deep and growing love she felt for the man standing before her. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "Yes, I will marry you, Clayton Ryder." The kiss that followed was their first sweet and tender, a promise of the life they would build together. When they finally separated, Clay took the ring from its box with slightly trembling hands and slipped it onto Josephine's finger. "Perfect fit," he murmured, a note of wonder in his voice. "Like us," Josephine replied softly. They announced their engagement at the Christmas Day gathering in the church hall, to general approval and a few knowing smiles from those who had predicted this outcome from the start. Mrs. Wilcox tearfully declared that while she would miss Josephine terribly, she couldn't be happier for the couple. Mayor Holcomb insisted on making a toast to Hecla's finest union of East and West, while Sarah beamed proudly, as if she personally had arranged the match. Only the bitter weather delayed their wedding. January brought storms so severe that travel between town and outlying ranches became not merely difficult but dangerous. Clay was trapped at the Double R for nearly 3 weeks, able to send word of his safety only when one of his ranch hands braved the journey to town for essential supplies. Josephine continued teaching through the harsh winter, her new ring a constant reminder of the future awaiting her when spring arrived. She used the enforced separation to prepare herself for the transition from schoolteacher to rancher's wife, borrowing books on household management from Mrs. Wilcox and learning what she could about cattle ranching from the fathers of her students. When February finally brought a thaw, and Clay was able to reach town again, their reunion was sweet but brief, constrained by propriety and Clay's need to return to the ranch to assess the winter's damage. They set their wedding date for the first Saturday in April, when travel would be more reliable and before the demands of spring calving would consume Clay's time. "Will you miss teaching?" Clay asked during one of his Sunday visits. "When you come to the ranch?" Josephine considered the question honestly. "Yes, I will. I've come to love it more than I expected," Clay nodded thoughtfully. "The ranch is 5 miles from town, not so far that you couldn't ride in a couple of days a week if you wanted to continue with some of your students." "You wouldn't mind?" Josephine asked, touched by his understanding. "Mind? Why would I mind you doing something that brings you happiness? Besides," he added with a wry smile, "ranching's hard work, but it has its quiet seasons. You might be glad for something else to occupy your mind." It was his consistent respect for her as a person with her own needs and desires that confirmed for Josephine the rightness of her decision. In Boston, she had known men who viewed wives as ornaments or possessions. Clay saw her as a partner. March brought the preparations for their wedding into full swing. The entire town seemed involved in some capacity, from Sarah, who insisted on baking the wedding cake, to Mrs. Jenkins, who offered the services of her seamstress sister-in-law for Josephine's dress. Even Josephine's students contributed, the girls making paper flowers for decorations, and the boys solemnly promising to be on their best behavior for the ceremony. Clay, meanwhile, was preparing their home. He added feminine touches to the ranch house curtains ordered from Helena, a proper dining set to replace the rough table he'd been using, even a small piano delivered at great expense from Butt. "You didn't tell me you played," Josephine said when he mentioned this last addition. "I don't," Clay replied with a smile, "but you mentioned once that you did, and I thought, well, music would be nice. In a home." These small gestures of thoughtfulness continued to surprise and delight Josephine as their wedding day approached. When she expressed concern about being so far from town, Clay arranged for a telephone line to be installed, one of the first in the area connecting the ranch to Hecla's small exchange. "So you won't feel isolated," he explained, "and in case of emergencies." The first Saturday in April dawned clear and mild, as if nature itself approved of the union about to take place. Josephine stood in her room at Mrs. Wilcox's boarding house, gazing at her reflection in the small mirror. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant cream-colored silk with lace trim, made over from a gown Mrs. Jenkins' sister-in-law had brought from back east. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Wilcox said from the doorway, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Just beautiful." "I'm nervous," Josephine admitted, smoothing the fabric of her skirt. "Is that strange? I'm completely certain about Clay, and yet—" "Not strange at all," Mrs. Wilcox assured her. "Marriage is a big step, especially when it comes with as many changes as yours will. But that man loves you something fierce, and you love him. The rest will sort itself out." The church was filled to capacity when Josephine walked down the aisle on Mayor Holcomb's arm, the mayor having offered to give her away in the absence of her father. Clay waited at the altar, looking both solemn and joyful in a new suit ordered specially for the occasion. When he took her hand, his warmth and strength steadied her trembling fingers. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and certain in the hushed church. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Clay's kiss was gentle but held a promise that sent warmth flooding through Josephine's veins. The celebration afterward in the church hall was a typical Hecla affair: abundant food, music provided by local talent, and a sense of community that enveloped the newly married couple in goodwill. Clay kept Josephine close by his side, his pride evident in the way he introduced her to the few guests she hadn't yet met. "Mrs. Ryder," he murmured during a quiet moment, testing the sound of it. "My wife, Mr. Ryder," she returned with a smile. "My husband." As evening fell, they departed amid cheers and well wishes, climbing into the wagon that would take them to their new home. Clay had insisted they spend their wedding night at the ranch rather than in town, wanting Josephine's first impression of their home to be special. The 5-mile journey passed in companionable conversation, both of them a little shy now that they were finally alone together as husband and wife. When they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Josephine gasped in surprise. The house was larger and more impressive than she had imagined: 2 stories of solid timber construction, with a wide veranda wrapping around the front. Lamps had been lit in every window, creating a warm, welcoming glow against the deepening twilight. As they drew closer, Josephine could see a flower box beneath each window, freshly planted with early spring blooms. "Clay, it's beautiful," she said, genuinely impressed. "You never told me the house was so grand." He looked pleased but embarrassed by her praise. "Wanted to build something that would last, something worthy of a family." When they reached the house, Clay surprised her by lifting her from the wagon and carrying her across the threshold, a gesture that made Josephine laugh with delight despite its predictability. Inside, the house was warm and inviting, with simple but well-made furniture and touches that spoke of careful preparation: fresh flowers on the dining table, new curtains at the windows, a fire laid ready in the stone hearth. "Let me show you around," Clay said, setting her gently on her feet but keeping an arm around her waist. The tour revealed a home that blended practicality with unexpected comforts. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, with a modern cast iron stove. The parlor featured not only the promised piano, but also bookshelves that Clay had built himself, ready for Josephine's small collection to fill them. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms waited for future occupants, and the master bedroom at the end of the hall held a large 4-poster bed covered with a handmade quilt. "Mrs. Wilcox helped with that," Clay explained when Josephine admired the quilt. "Said every proper marriage bed needs a good quilt." There was an awkward moment then, both of them suddenly aware of what the night would bring. Clay cleared his throat. "Are you hungry? Mrs. Martinez, my foreman's wife, left supper for us, or would you prefer? That is, would you like some time to?" Josephine took pity on his discomfort, touching his cheek gently. "I think I would like to change first," she said. "And then perhaps we could have supper by the fire." Clay nodded, visibly relieved to have a plan. "I'll bring your trunk up and light the fire." Alone in the bedroom that was now hers, there's Josephine changed from her wedding dress into the nightgown and robe she had sewn for this occasion. The garments were modest but made of fine fabric, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. She brushed out her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders, then took a deep breath to steady her nerves before descending the stairs. Clay had lit the fire and set out the meal misses. Martinez had prepared a savory stew, fresh bread, and a bottle of wine that must have been procured specially for the occasion. He had removed his jacket and tie but otherwise remained dressed, a consideration that touched Josephine deeply. They ate by firelight, talking easily about the wedding, the guests, and their plans for the coming days. Clay described the workings of the ranch, and Josephine shared her ideas for the house. The wine and the warmth of the fire gradually eased the tension between them, and by the time they had finished eating, a new kind of anticipation had replaced their earlier nervousness. "Dance with me," Clay asked suddenly, rising and offering his hand. "There's no music," Josephine pointed out, even as she placed her hand in his. "We'll make our own," he replied, drawing her close and beginning to hum softly as they moved together in the firelit room. Josephine recognized the tune "Beautiful Dreamer," a Stephen Foster song she had taught her students for the Christmas pageant. She rested her head against Clay's chest, feeling the vibration of the melody through his body, and closed her eyes in perfect contentment. When the impromptu dance ended, Clay tipped her face up to his and kissed her, not with the restrained propriety of their courthouse kiss, but with a depth of feeling that left her breathless. When they parted, his eyes were dark with desire, but his voice was gentle when he spoke. "I love you, Josephine Ryder," he said simply, "and I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." "You already are," she whispered, and took his hand to lead him upstairs to the bedroom that awaited them. The days and weeks that followed established the pattern of their new life together. Clay taught Josephine about the ranch, the rhythms of the seasons, the care of livestock, the management of the land. Josephine brought order and beauty to the house, creating a home that reflected both their tastes and needs. Twice a week, Clay drove her into town to continue teaching, having arranged with the town council for her to work with the advanced students who were preparing for further education. Spring brought the busy calving season, with Clay often working from before dawn until well after dark. Josephine learned to assist with the simpler tasks, gradually gaining confidence in her abilities as a rancher's wife. She found unexpected satisfaction in the physical work, in seeing tangible results from her efforts. Summer came with its own demands: hay cutting, fence mending, preparation for the fall roundup. Josephine planted a vegetable garden near the house, learning through trial and error what would grow in the Montana soil. In the evenings, they would sit on the veranda, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, sharing the events of their day and their hopes for the future. It was on such an evening in late August, as they sat hand in hand in the gathering twilight, that Josephine finally found the courage to share the news she had suspected for several weeks. "Clay," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter of excitement in her chest, "I believe we're going to have a baby." Clay went very still, his hand tightening around hers. "A baby," he repeated as if testing the word. "You're sure?" Josephine nodded. "As sure as I can be, doctor. Henderson confirmed it yesterday when I was in town." For a moment, Clay said nothing, and Josephine felt a flicker of uncertainty. Then he turned to her, and in the fading light she could see that his eyes were wet with tears. "A baby," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child." He pulled her gently into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious glass. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for coming to Hecla, for staying, for making my life complete." Josephine closed her eyes, savoring the moment. From that first day on the boardwalk, hungry, alone, and uncertain of her future, to this evening on their veranda, expecting their first child. It had been a journey she could never have anticipated but would never regret. "I was thinking," Clay said after a while, still holding her close, "that if it's a girl we might name her Sarah." After Sarah from the cafe, Josephine asked, surprised. Clay nodded. If she hadn't been open that day you fainted, if I hadn't taken you there. He shrugged, unable to complete the thought. Josephine smiled, understanding perfectly. Sarah is a beautiful name, she agreed. And if it's a boy, Thomas, Clay suggested after a moment's consideration. After my father. He never got to see what I built here, but I think he would have been proud. Sarah or Thomas Ryder, Josephine mused, resting her hand on her still flat stomach. Either way, this child will be loved. More than they can imagine, Clay affirmed, covering her hand with his own. They sat together as darkness fell completely, the stars emerging one by one in the vast Montana sky. Josephine thought of the journey that had brought her here, the desperation and hunger that had led to her collapse on a dusty boardwalk, and the good man who had carried her to safety and ultimately into a life filled with purpose and love. No regrets. Clay asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. Josephine turned her face up to his, her heart full of certainty. Not one, she assured him, and sealed the promise with a kiss. In the spring of 1878, Josephine gave birth to a healthy son they named Thomas Clayton Ryder. The following year brought a daughter, Sarah Elizabeth. By the time their third child, William James, arrived in 1881, the Double R had grown to become one of the most successful ranches in Madison County, and Clay had been elected to the territorial legislature. Josephine continued to teach part-time until her family and the ranch demanded her full attention. Even then, she remained involved in education, establishing a small library in Hecla and advocating for improved schools throughout the territory. They faced challenges, of course, harsh winters, economic downturns, the natural disasters that were part of frontier life. But they faced them together, their partnership strengthened by mutual respect and deepening love. The hunger that had once brought Josephine to her knees on a Hecla boardwalk had been satisfied in ways she could never have imagined, not just with food, but with purpose, community, and the enduring love of the cowboy who had carried her to his table and stayed by her side. And on summer evenings, when the work was done and their children played in the yard, Clay and Josephine would sit on their veranda, hands entwined, and watch the sun set over the mountains of their Montana home, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together and the courage that had kept them there.